So we are continuing our study. We began back in June. Here we are in August. We're picking up tonight in Hosea chapter 9. So if you're looking there at that outline, we've gone through the first 3 chapters. We've looked at the life of Hosea and his wife Gomer. We talked about the significance of God's command to the prophet Hosea to go and to take to himself a wife of harlotry and to take on children of harlotry. And we talked about how that symbolizes for us God's relationship with his people. We then moved the beginning of chapter 4 on to where we were on Sunday morning, about midway through chapter 9. Throughout this whole section of the book, the prophet uses intensely legal language. The legal penalties for adultery, the legal penalties under the Old Covenant for violating the terms of the law. That's essentially what the prophet has continued to build up, is this case the Lord has against Israel's unfaithfulness. Now we move into a section in the middle of chapter 9 and kind of moving to the beginning of chapter 12, where the prophet is going to give us a series of images now. He's already been, we've seen, fairly poetic. He's used a lot of imagery to convey his point to us that God is coming to judge his people for their unfaithfulness. Now the whole point of that is to bring them to a point to where they repent. As we looked at last week with Dave, in chapter 7 and chapter 8, they were not willing to repent. There is no indication at this point in Israel's history that they had any intention to change their mind, to change their ways and to turn back to God. And so that brings us to chapter 9. The language we've already seen a little bit. The punishment is drawing nearer. If you want to turn real quick to chapter 5, look at verse 8. The prophet says there, "Blow the ram's horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah. Sound the alarm at Beth-aven. Look behind you, O Benjamin." The beginning of chapter 8. "Set the ram's horn to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law." So you go from a horn being blown in chapter 5 and an attack coming, and we even know the direction it's coming from. We know it's heading south. We know it's heading from Israel, actually, down to Judah. So here, this great Assyrian army is preparing to come down, and you see that beginning to happen in chapter 5. The beginning of chapter 8 is not just the horn, though. Somebody else is circling overhead. The vultures are gathered. They're following the troops because the battle's about to happen and mealtime is about to begin. When the vultures circle, you know something's dead. And so the prophet is trying to say that his judgment is coming. So last week, or rather where we were on Sunday, chapter 9, verse 7, the verse begins, "The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. And Israel shall know it." Israel shall know it. So as we begin chapter 9, the language begins to shift. Some of the same things that have been going on in the book will continue to go on. It's still the same prophet writing to the same group of people. He's going to be talking about the same kinds of sins that the people of Israel are committing. But what he's going to do from this point forward, or at least for the next 3 chapters or so, he's going to use much more natural imagery. He's going to turn to agriculture. He's going to turn to nature. And he's going to use those symbols as a way to hopefully get through to the people of Israel. So if you were to title this section that begins in chapter 9, verse 10, and goes through chapter 10 to verse 10, you'll notice it's kind of 2 sections there on the outline. You could call it Grapes of Wrath. Grapes of Wrath, quite literally, because of what the prophet is going to talk us through tonight. So we're going to begin in chapter 9, verse 10, and we're going to read down through verse 14. God speaks, saying, "Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit of the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame. They became detestable like the thing they loved. Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them until none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow. But Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Give them, O Lord. What will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Now Hosea's kind of stepped up his game in these verses. He's already used fairly vivid imagery up to this point. He's making himself even more clear as he begins this section, as he opens up this new section. So imagine yourself first in the wilderness there in verse 10. Wildernesses are not known for their great luxuriant vines, right? So imagine your delight. You're stranded for whatever reason in the middle of the desert. Nothing grows, and you come across grapes. You come across food. You come across something that can give you sustenance. And not just sustenance, but hydration. The grapes are growing. That doesn't mean that there's really that much water nearby. So when you look at the way God describes his people there, he gives them a positive symbol. He says, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. You were a blessing to me. You were a refreshment to me. But then notice what he says in the next two lines. Like the first fruit of the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers. So they are grapes, they are figs. He's calling them both. He's saying, I found you as something that I enjoy. And then he concludes the verse, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame, and became detestable like the thing they loved. They came to Baal Peor and they consecrated themselves to the thing of shame. So turn, if you will, with me back to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 25. Numbers 25. So here the nation of Israel is literally in the wilderness. This is where God and his people Israel spend their honeymoon. Here they are in the desert. They've gone on safari, but not for the reasons why we would today, right? Remember, they were in the desert because of their sin. And so notice what happens in Numbers 25. While Israel lived in Shittim, or the acacia grove, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He found them like grapes in the wilderness, like the first fruits of a fig tree. And they consecrated themselves to the thing of shame in Baal Peor. Their worship of Baal went all the way back to their wilderness wanderings. They've been struggling with this sin in their lives for that long. At this point in their history, you're looking at essentially 700 years later, they're having the same problem now with Baal worship. So what does he do? He says in verse 11, your glory shall fly away like a bird. There's another metaphor he's going to throw out there. Just as a bird flies away, your glory will be fleeting. You're not going to be able to look on your days like you do right now, your days of prosperity, your days of strength, and your days of a strong economy. You're not going to be able to look on that way anymore. They've sought fertility in Baal, so what is he going to take away? Fertility. He's going to show them that Baal is not the he's not the one who provides those blessings. So he says, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Now that might seem harsh. But what God is trying to tell his people is when you choose to sin, you have chosen your own punishment. When you choose to sin and depart from me, you have chosen your own punishment. The punishment in the Bible always fits the crime. What was Cain the tiller of? What was it that cried out to him when he slew his brother? The ground. What was he driven out of as a consequence? The land. He was driven out literally from the ground. The ground he had tilled all of his life, He was driven from that ground. The punishment fit the crime. When you look then at what God is trying to tell them is, if you want fertility, you're going to have to come to the one who gives it. And that's me. So look at what he says in verse 12, the last half of it. Woe to them when I depart from them. I'm the one who gives life, not Baal. When I leave, you can't have that life. You can only have death. They chose their own punishment. So then he gives them another image in verse 13. And your translation may read a little bit differently here. But in verse 13, the ESV reads, Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow. But Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. The first line is an idea of an oasis in the desert. Here you have this palm tree growing in a meadow in the middle of the wilderness in verse 10. But what's going to end up happening is it's not going to be an oasis of life. It's not going to be a place where they go to live and enjoy things. God found them that way. The very next verse tells them what's ahead, the very next line. That Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Now, if you're reading in the ESV, you might want to add quotation marks around verse 14. Who is speaking now in verse 14? Hosea. There's really only two voices you hear in the whole book. Hosea and the Lord. Listen to what Hosea says. Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. The life that they sought through idol worship was going to be the life God took away to remind them who the living God is. Now that's a change. Notice what Hosea is doing. Go back to chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Again, there's only two voices heard throughout the book of Hosea, the prophets and God's. Verses 1 through 3, you'll notice your quotation marks are probably different on those three verses. Listen to what the prophet had called them to before. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck down and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. So just 3 chapters ago, the prophet was calling out to the people of Israel to come and return to the Lord. Well, 3 chapters later, the prophet realizes how far they've gone. They're not coming back. Notice the prophet's own change of heart here. At one point in his ministry, he recognizes that people are going to possibly change. 3 chapters later, he intensifies his argument, not because they're past the point of return, but because he knows they're getting close. He steps up his rhetoric because they have fallen so far into sin, it has not registered to them yet what God is about to do. They don't hear the horns blowing. They don't see the vultures circling. They're still thinking things are okay, all the while Assyria is preparing for war. And so the prophet says, give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. When you look at what God has done in these 4 verses, these 5 verses, he calls them at first figs and fruit. He talks about their fruitfulness. Here they are, these grapes, these figs. But ultimately, they're going to be a bird. A bird who at the moment of the battle will fly away. Their glory is going to be fleeting. And they're not going to have the kind of fertility they sought through false worship. God is going to remove that from the picture. So notice what he says in verses 15 through 17. The voice again switches back. God now speaks, and listen to what he says about his people. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I began to hate them. Because of the wickedness of their deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebels. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them, because they have not listened to me. They shall be wanderers among the nations. Notice the parallels between verses 10 through 14 and verses 15 through 17. God again reminds them of their past, but he doesn't take them back to the wilderness. Do you remember when we mentioned Gilgal before? Why was Gilgal significant to the nation of Israel? I'll give you a hint. Joshua 5 through 7. Remember what happens there? It seems significant to them because this is a place, I just heard it, where they crossed the Jordan. This is the place where they circumcised the second generation of Israelites out of Egypt. This is the place they partook of the first Passover outside or within the Promised Land. This is where the manna and the quail stop. This Gilgal. This should be a happy place, right? Like grapes in the wilderness. But it's not. Because he says when he thinks about what they did, what happens right after that? What happens after they defeat Jericho? Where do they go then? They go to Ai. And Ai doesn't turn out as well as Jericho. Because in their pride, they think they figured it out. They think they can go and they can conquer the Promised Land on their own terms. They don't have to be faithful to God. They don't go and seek his advice. God doesn't give them a plan on how to attack Ai until they come to him for it. And so they lose. Right after Gilgal, they fail to inquire of the Lord and they begin to make mistakes. And the history of Israel is all downhill from there. There I began to hate them. Because of the wickedness of their deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. Now those are all in the future tense. God is still hoping they will change. God continues to speak and call them to repentance and threatens this punishment that to him is unthinkable because he hopes that to them it is unthinkable. But just like he said in chapter 9, they're going to have to leave. I will drive them out of my house. I will drive them out of my land. When was it that man was first driven out? So if you think back in your mind to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, the man and his wife, Adam and Eve, are driven out of the garden. Just as they were driven out of the garden as a punishment for their sins, God is telling the people of Israel, I am driving you out of my house. Just like Adam and Eve lost their personal contact with God because of their sin. They could no longer hear the voice of the Lord walking in the midst of the garden. They didn't have that intimate communion with him anymore. Instead, they had angels with fiery swords blocking their path because of their sin. God tells Israel now, that punishment is yours. And then he says something else in verse 17. You can begin a set of quotes at the beginning of verse 17 as well. Because the speaker again changes back to Hosea. My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers among the nations. That word is translated over in Genesis chapter 4 as vagabond. Who was sent away as a vagabond? I heard two whispers. It wasn't just Adam and Eve who sinned. The sin continued to spread. Cain is called a vagabond. He is made to be a wanderer outside of even the land he had tilled, outside of the garden. So notice what's happened. Here we are, created in paradise. Adam and Eve ruin it. Here they are driven out of the garden. 2 angels block their way with fiery swords. And their sons fall because of the same kind of sin. Different sin, but it's still a violation of the one God's rule. One son killed the other. Both fell. One will rise again. When you think about what it is that's promised to Cain then, he becomes a vagabond. He becomes a wanderer. He's continually driven out of the presence of the Lord. That's even what he says, right? So God places a mark on him to protect the seed of Adam. Things could have ended right there. And so we begin to see a pattern. Not just at Gilgal, not just in Numbers chapter 25. We see a pattern that goes all the way back to Adam, as it said in chapter 6, verse 7. Like Adam, they have transgressed my covenant. This isn't just Israel's story. You remember the phrase we used a generation ago? If I don't hit him in Jesus, I'll hit him in Adam. The brotherhood of man goes back there. When you think about what it is that we then look to, this is our story. This is the pattern of our own lives. Gilgal is our story. The wilderness is our story. Eden is our story. And so is the land of God. We were vagabonds. We were in the wilderness. God found us like grapes. Or as it said there in verse 13, as a young palm planted in a meadow. We destroyed paradise. And so they're going to be driven out of the land. They're going to become wanderers. They want to wander. They want to go their own way. God says, fine. You can't do it, though, in my house. That's the word he uses there in verse 15. I will drive them out of my house, my dwelling place. This is where I am. You're going to have to leave. So then he gives us another series of images in chapter 10. In verses 1 through 8, he piles them on even further. He says, Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. He will break down their pillars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They utter mere words. With empty oaths they make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Bethlehem. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests. Those who rejoiced over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Now you begin to see, hopefully, in that last verse where the prophet is moving, and how much that story is really ours. He's already called them grapes. He's already called them figs. He called them a bird with their glory flying away in verse 11. He's called them a palm tree that has essentially been defiled and prepared for slaughter. Now he says they are a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. But just like he said back in chapter 4, how did they interpret their wealth? When things went well, where did they go? They left him. They needed God while they were poor and while they were slaves. Once that no longer applied to them, they thought their religion didn't either. Is that the way we treat God? Is God only the God of the dead? Is he only there when things aren't going well? No, he's the one who's there whether things are going well or not. who through his providence is making things better. We know that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, Romans 8:28. They forgot that. They interpreted their wealth as a sign of their own strength. And because of that, look at what it says. Look at what they used their riches for. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. These aren't altars to God. These aren't pillars in the temple of God. These are altars to Baal and pillars or Asherah to another fertility goddess of that area of the world. You look at what exactly he's doing. He's trying to show them that they have misapplied their riches. They had forgotten the grace they had received. They had forgotten their redemption. And they had used the very blessings God had given them for sin. So God will remove the blessings. He is repeating himself in hopes that they will eventually get this. And the more times he says it, the deeper he will get into their calloused hearts. But notice what that leads to in verse 2. Their heart is false. Their heart is lying to them. Now they must bear their guilt. He, the Lord, will break down their altars and destroy their pillars. Now we talked about this both on Sunday and then with Dave last week. How they had repeatedly not just been unfaithful to God, but even the human rulers that they had said they wanted on the throne, they almost immediately planned to overthrow. And so notice what it says in verse 3. We have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. But a king, what would he do for us? Notice what it says in verse 4. They utter mere words, empty words. Idle talk is the way the ESV translates that over in Isaiah 34. With empty oaths they make covenants. They're not just lying to me, they're lying to their neighbors. They're lying to their kings. They're lying to their princes. The priests are lying to the people. Lies abound. No wonder their hearts are false. Notice, remember how he began this section. In verse 10 of chapter 9. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame, and became detestable like the thing they loved. They worshipped a lie, so they became liars. Their unfaithfulness is affecting each and every way that they interact with one another, each and every way they act toward other nations, and each and every way they react and respond even to their Lord. So notice what he says. In verse 1 of chapter 10, they're a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. But notice what they are now in verse 4. Judgment springs up like poisonous weeds. The vine is going to be taken over. Poisonous weeds are hemlock. The New King James reads there. They're growing up as hemlock. Here they were, this fruitful vine. Now they will grow up like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field. And he says in verses 5 and 6, it's because of their idol worship. The calf that they wanted, the altars that they built would all be torn down. We talked about on Sunday how Josiah was the one who did that. The calf, as you see here, was literally carried off as tribute to the great king. But Josiah came back even after that point and tore down the idols, broke it down to bits. And before he did that, he burned on it the bones of the idolatrous priests. Seems harsh, doesn't it? Unless you remember Sinai. Even touched the holy mountain in death. Now it doesn't seem so extreme. Now that altar looks pretty foolish. Those calves look pretty foolish. That was 700 years ago. They had forgotten. Its people mourn for it in verse 5, and so do its idolatrous priests. Those who rejoice over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. At the end of verse 6, notice the play on words here again. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. The idol was the shame of Israel. And so in the taking away of that idol, they're going to realize their shame like they never have before. I Like we looked at last week in chapter 9, Israel shall know it. They'll know the days of punishment and recompense have come. So notice verses 7 and 8. He gives another image. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. Now imagine for a moment the mightiest river or mountain stream you can. If you've seen it, imagine that one. Now imagine a twig floating in those waters. The twig floating on water has no decision on what happens to it. Where it goes, how fast it goes, whether it floats, whether it's going to be plunged under in the rapids, whether it goes off the waterfall. It's carried by the water. The stick, the twig, has no choice. What God is saying to Hosea is that Samaria, the capital of Israel, those 10 northern tribes, Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. The twig doesn't last long in the river. And that's where Israel is headed. And they're heading there fast. They're no longer planted. They're no longer stable. They've been broken off the vine and they're floating down the stream at full speed. In one direction. Down. The only way water flows. The high places of Aid and the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. Notice what he says though. Another growth will happen, just like poisonous weeds. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars. And they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Where else have we seen thorns and thistles? You noticing a pattern here? You go again back to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, verse 18. Adam and Eve were given one job: to tend and keep the garden. Those words literally mean to serve and protect. To serve and protect. One job. Told to do one other thing. Not to eat of that one tree. Do you remember what they ate in the garden before? They ate of every tree in the garden, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They walked up to the tree, they took and ate. Part of Adam's punishment in Genesis chapter 3, starting really in verse 17 is where God begins to talk about this, is that now they're going to have to work the land. They're not just serving and protecting the garden. They're now going to be working the land. They're going to be plowing. They're going to be planting. They're going to be sweating. They're going to be working hard. That same kind of freedom is not there. And God says in Genesis 3, verse 18, I will give you thorns and thistles. Thorns and thistles. So he calls them, in verse 10 of chapter 9, grapes in the wilderness, the first fruit on the fig tree, a young palm planted in the meadow, a luxuriant vine. But as it says there in chapter 9, verse 16, their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. They're not just going to be able to take and eat. And even when they dig up the ground, even when they do all the things they're supposed to do, God is still going to bring hunger upon us. It will be so bad, it says in verse 8, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Now this is the next indication that this story is not just theirs. Where else do we hear that echo? Where else do we read those words? Revelation is one of them. And there's one almost exactly in the middle between those two. Between Hosea and Revelation. Where's the other one? Jesus. So Jesus says over in Luke chapter 23, verse 30, he says, when Israel's unfaithfulness gets to a certain point, Jerusalem itself will be destroyed, and they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Jesus wasn't saying that Hosea's prophecy had not been fulfilled. He's saying that Hosea's prophecy becomes fulfilled when you make the same mistake that Israel made. When we turn from God, whether we were Israel then or the church now, we will cry out for the mountains to cover us and for the hills to fall on us. Notice the pattern that Jesus then establishes. Adam and Eve, Cain, Numbers 25 at Baal Peor, Gilgal in Joshua 5 verse 7, or 5 through 7. The Gospels. And then John tells us we're not done. Because as you mentioned, sister, in Revelation, John says the same thing. John says in Revelation 6, verses 15 and following, that when God comes to judge Rome, guess what the people will cry out? For the mountains to cover us, to the hills to fall on us. Brethren, we're in bad company when we turn from the Lord. The mountains they had gone up to worship their idols would now fall upon them. The hills that they had gone up to worship Asherah would now be where they sought their shelter. And what God tells them is they're not going to be able to do it. We looked at that back in chapter 5. You can run from me, but you can't hide. Because I'm the one who sees all things. Your sin will find you out. So look at verses 9 and 10. From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the children of injustice overtake them in Gibeah? When I please, I will discipline them, and nations shall be gathered against them, when they are bound for their double iniquity. God says here, this isn't the first time Israel has done this. This isn't the first time they have turned from you. But this is the first time as a nation I'm going to bring such a judgment upon them that they will never forget it. You know, the Jews have a lot of problems after Samaria escaped. You know the one thing they don't go back to do? They don't go back to idol worship. They don't go back to Baal. They learn their lesson. Judah comes back. The Messiah comes. The Messiah who in John 15 says, I am the vine. You want to bear fruit? Abide in me. Or else I will prune the branches to get growth. I will throw the excess where? To the fire. Matthew chapter 13, Jesus says something very similar. He says, let the wheat and the weeds essentially grow up together. And on the day of judgment, like Dave pointed out last week, there will be a harvest. We'll sort the wheat from the weeds. We'll know the difference. Revelation 14 and following, you can write that down to read later. Because Jesus, through John, combines both those symbols. Grapes of wrath. He says, I'm going to come and I'm not only going to cut down the harvest, I'm going to throw the grapes from the vine into the winepress of the wrath of God, and I'm going to trample it. And then he says, the blood will flow. Not the grape juice. He drops the metaphor. The blood will flow. When we think about what it is God has called us to, we have a choice. We can either be the grapes he finds in the wilderness, the first fruit of the figs, the palm planted in the meadow, the luxuriant vine that abides in Christ, or we can be the grapes of wrath. That's a vine too. But it's the vine that is trampled under the foot of the Son of God on that last day.